In 1413 England, becoming a mother was the most dangerous thing a woman could do. Not war, not famine, not plague, childbirth. 1 in every 5 women did not survive it, and the ones who did survive it would face it again and again and again, because a medieval marriage produced an average of 8 pregnancies over a lifetime. This is what it actually looked like. Cold dawn, January, a village somewhere in rural Lincolnshire. The fire has been burning since midnight, not for warmth, but because fire means light, and light means the midwife can see what she is doing. Her name is Agnes. She is 58 years old. She has attended over 400 births in this village and the 3 surrounding it. She has never read a single word about medicine because she cannot read. Every piece of knowledge she carries exists only in her hands and in her memory, passed down from the woman who taught her, stretching back generations in an unbroken chain of inherited survival. She examines her tools: simple cloths, carved wooden bowls, dried herbs hung near the fire, lavender for calming, pennyroyal for pain, raspberry leaf steeped in boiling water given to the mother in small sips throughout the early hours. None of these remedies are proven by any science we would recognize today. Most of them actually work. Here is something that surprises people when they learn it. Men were not allowed in the birth room. Not the husband, not the father, not any physician. The birth room was entirely female. The midwife, the elder women of the village, the neighbors who had been through this themselves. The husband waited outside, sometimes in the barn because the livestock still needed tending regardless of what was happening inside, saying very little, listening to sounds through the walls. This was not cruelty. Women attended births because women understood births. A young woman attending her first birth as a helper at 14 would attend her second at 15, her third at 16. By the time she was 20, she had seen things that would take a modern medical student years of formal training to encounter. Experience was the curriculum. Survival was the examination. There were 3 moments in every birth that Agnes feared above all others. The first was the position of the child. A breech birth where the child came feet or bottom first killed mothers and children at rates that are genuinely difficult to read about. Agnes could attempt to turn a child manually. She had done it successfully many times. She had also failed. She remembered every failure by name. The second fear was bleeding. Hemorrhage after birth was the single largest killer of mothers in medieval England. Agnes had remedies. Some worked, some did not. She had no way of knowing in advance which situation she was walking into. The third fear was the one nobody talked about openly, but every woman in that room understood. Fever. The slow fever that came 3 or 4 days later, when the mother had survived the birth itself and the family had begun to breathe. The fever that spread through the blood from infections that medieval medicine had no framework for understanding and no tools for fighting. The fever that killed women who had done everything right. Agnes could not prevent it. She could only watch for it and pray she was wrong about what she was seeing. Hours pass. Outside, snow has been falling since early morning. The village has pulled inward around this one room the way communities do around crisis. Bread has appeared at the doorstep without knocking. A jug of barley broth. Extra firewood stacked against the outer wall. Nobody organized this. It simply happened because in a village of 200 people where every family's survival depends on every other family, instinct and obligation have become indistinguishable. Agnes works with information that would seem impossibly sparse to a modern midwife. No clocks, no monitors, only touch, observation, and the count of breaths between contractions. She speaks constantly, low, steady, specific. Move here, breathe this way. When the next one comes, do not fight it. Here is the part most historical accounts move past too quickly. Surviving birth was only the beginning. In 1413 England, 1 in 3 children did not reach their 5th birthday. Dysentery, smallpox, measles, whooping cough, scarlet fever, diseases we now vaccinate against in a single afternoon, claimed children with a regularity that shaped everything about how medieval families lived and prayed and hoped. Parents in medieval England loved their children fiercely. The idea that they were emotionally detached because childhood mortality was high is a myth historians have spent decades correcting. But they also knew the reality. Every child baptized within 24 hours of birth, not only because the church demanded it, but because parents needed to know that if the worst happened in those first fragile days, their child would not be denied heaven on a technicality. That is not superstition. That is love operating inside a framework of terrifying uncertainty. Agnes learned everything from her predecessor, Margaret, who practiced for 40 years before her hands grew too unsteady to be trusted. Margaret taught Agnes through demonstration, through years of watching and assisting and asking questions. This is how medical knowledge moved in 1413 England, person to person, village to village, carried in the memories of women who were never credited in any official record, never studied in any institution, never paid beyond what the village could spare. The church had an ambiguous relationship with midwives. They performed emergency baptisms when a child was dying too fast to wait for a priest, but the herbs they used, the rituals some practiced, the prayers offered to saints not officially sanctioned, all of this existed in a gray space most parish priests preferred not to examine too closely. The midwife in your village kept mothers alive. Asking too many questions about her methods was a luxury available only to people who did not need those methods to survive. A cry cuts through the sound of wind and fire and prayer. Sharp, clear, unmistakably alive. Agnes catches the child. Her movements are practiced and completely calm. She checks the infant, clears the airway, ties and cuts the cord. Then she hands the child to the elder woman nearest her, turns back to the mother, and begins the work most people forget happens after the birth. The work that determines whether the mother walks out of this room in the coming days or becomes part of the grief the village carries forward. Only when the bleeding is controlled and the mother is stable and the infant is breathing strongly does Agnes allow herself a single exhale. The door opens. Cold air rushes in. Someone begins to cry, not from grief but from the release of hours of held breath. The husband is brought to the doorway. He looks at his wife. He looks at the child. He says thank you to Agnes. Agnes nods. She's already thinking about the next thing that needs to be done. The danger is not over. Agnes visits every day for the first week, checking for the fever she dreads with the back of her hand pressed to the forehead, the neck, the wrist. The village continues surrounding the new mother practically. Meals, help with household work, neighbors quietly absorbing some of the husband's farm duties without being asked. Agnes will retire in 7 years. Before she does, she will spend those 7 years teaching her successor, a 17-year-old named Joan who has been attending births as her assistant for 3 years. Joan will practice for 42 years. She will attend over 600 births. She will save lives using techniques she learned from Agnes, who learned them from Margaret, who learned them from a woman whose name nobody remembers. The church scribes did not record their names. The physicians who appeared in English towns over the following century did not acknowledge their knowledge. The formal history of medicine largely ignores them. But the village remembers. The village always remembers. In 1413 England, the most dangerous day of your life was the day you were born, and the woman who stood between you and death that day learned everything she knew from memory, from observation, and from a chain of women stretching back further than any written record could follow. Drop in the comments, which part of this surprised you most? Because for most people, it is not the mortality rates or the tools or even the absence of men in the room. It is the realization that the woman doing all of this had never once been allowed to call herself a doctor.